Section K, the radio revolution. So we see in the 1890s, before we have the standardized radio, kind of the precursors of the radio. We see Guglielmo Marconi invent a wireless telegraph. So the idea is now you don't need wires, they're using radio waves to communicate. So this telegraph communication used during World War I, that sparks the idea, hey, couldn't we, transmit human voices in the same way? So that gives rise to the radio. The radio at first was more of a local thing. You could listen, maybe there'd be a local station, but through the 20s, as technology and infrastructure progresses, we really see kind of national radio stations with national programming, that sort of thing. And because of this is the first time we really see commercials make a debut. There's a difference, because like in Europe, a lot of the radio stations were owned by the government, so there was zero commercials. But in America, the radio was used more as a commercial tool, a tool to use to sell products. Soap operas, right? We've all heard of soap operas. That gets their name to the fact that, soap companies would sponsor these programs on the radio. Okay. And also, it's starting to draw families together again. Families will sit together in the parlor, that sort of thing, listening to radio programs together. And it's also kind of the first step in creating a national culture. Everyone across the country is listening to similar programs, like Amos and Andy, which was a comedy show. Also now politics, you can listen or keep up with current events from the comfort of your living room. Also, you can listen to sports, you can listen to orchestras, and you can listen to preachers. And also now politicians had a new platform they had to kind of get used to. So now speeches weren't just read in newspapers, but now everyone could listen to a presidential candidate give a speech. So that's a difference as well. Okay, section L, Hollywood's Filmland Fantasies. Ooh, the publishers were getting fancy with this one. So anyway, the movie itself, the motion picture, was the fruit of many inventions, so we're not going to go there. But we are going to see progression, kind of baby steps the movie industries make. The first really movie we see is very, very short. This was created in 1903. It was called The Great Train Robbery, and this would be shown in kind of these 5-cent theaters, or Nickelodeons, like Nickels, 5 cents Nickelodeons. And then in 1915, we see the first full movie, or the full-length movie, and this is called The Birth of a Nation. So besides The Birth of a Nation being the first full-length movie, it's also a very controversial movie, because really in this movie, it glorifies the KKK of the Reconstruction era. It shows, African Americans as corrupt politicians and as rapists, really in a bad light. So we see a lot of African Americans actually through marches and petitions protesting this movie. But nonetheless, it goes down in history as being the first full-length movie, Birth of a Nation. Okay, and we see Hollywood in Southern California. Really, this is the time it becomes glamorous. It becomes Hollywood. We see the film studios really set up in Hollywood because, one, you're close to the sea, you're also close to mountains, you're close to deserts, there's a lot of good weather, so filming outside becomes more practical, that sort of thing. We see some of the earliest films involve some scantily clad vampires, and because of these, scantily clad vampires, we really see Hollywood as an industry start to censor themselves. So even in the 20s, as soon as Hollywood really starts going underway, we see this is actually when censorship also kind of tacks on to the industry as well. And Hollywood really arrives during World War I. And we talked about this a little bit before. A lot of anti-German kind of propaganda films are made. Kind of their slang is, hang the Kaiser films. Of course, the Kaiser being the leader of Germany. So we see a lot of anti-German films made in World War I. Okay. So finally, a little bit later on, 1927, we get the first talkie, or the first movie that actually has sound. And this is called The Jazz Singer. This random fact, right? 1927, The Jazz Singer, the first talking movie, is literally taught in every single American history class that ever existed, just so you know. Anyway, The Jazz Singer actually featured a white actor. His name is Al Johnson, who was dressing up as a black man. So that's called kind of blackface, when they'd paint your face black, leaving the white around the lips. So it's actually a white man portraying an African American. And just in the 20s in general, this whole idea of Hollywood. Now actors are becoming more popular or more famous than politicians, definitely also making more, popular stars, movie stars made more than the president. And once again, the idea here is just like the radio, just like the car, film really helps to standardize American culture. We see a lot of children of immigrants going to the Nickelodeons, having these experiences, and it really kind of standardizes an American culture, an American language, all of that stuff. Yeah. Section M, the dynamic decade. Okay, so Section M is all talking about kind of the fact that the morals were becoming loose, shall we say, during the 20s. So first thing to note, in 1920 we have a census, of course, I think every 10 years. 1920 census is the first census in American history where we see actually more people living in urban areas or in cities than in farms. So we're seeing that shift kind of being cemented. Now most Americans live in cities in the 20s. We see women working slowly but surely more and more outside of the homes. Mostly when women worked, however, they were kind of put into a box, right? This is women's work. Women can work in industries like being a retail clerk, being a secretary, and oftentimes those were also very low-paid jobs. We see Margaret Sanger during the 20s. This is when she's really becoming very vocal, being very much an advocate of contraception. We see Alice Paul. We've talked about her before. She helped get that 19th Amendment passed. Well, Alice Paul, the head of the National Women's Party, also during this time working now to get an equal rights amendment added to the Constitution. So a lot of movement kind of towards, women's rights, and also kind of this loose morality, some would say. Just a funny note, Alice Paul, HBO actually made a movie about her called Iron-Jawed Angels. So if you ever feel like you have nothing to do on a Saturday night, you can just probably YouTube Iron-Jawed Angels. Anyway, interesting, I suppose, but whatever. Okay, so still talking about the 20s and kind of the loosening of morality a bit. We see a lot of advertisers using sex to sell anything from, soap to tires. And the symbol of this new morality of the 20s, you can say, is the flapper, okay? The flapper is a girl that has bobbed hair, so kind of like my hair is short hair. I had a higher hemline, nothing compared to the hemlines of today, but hey, you could see her ankles, red cheeks, red lips, really just this carefree, independent, oftentimes smoking gal. And really the justification these young folks have is they really look to the writings of Dr. Sigmund Freud. Okay, so Sigmund Freud, obviously you've heard of him before. He was, you could say, a psychologist from Austria, and really his whole idea is that all of the kind of nervous and emotional ills of the time were really caused by repressed sexuality, and that it was healthiest thing to just express sexuality naturally and freely as much as you wanted. Don't repress that. So they really point to Freud as kind of the justification for their actions. We see a lot of more teenagers, making out in dark movie theaters, in the back of cars, all of that stuff. Yay! All right. Moving on. Jazz music. Hey, why not talk about jazz? of course, jazz starts with the African American community, and it really does start in the South, particularly in New Orleans. But during World War I, we talked about that first great immigration, where a lot of African Americans moved from the South to the North to get kind of those factory jobs during World War I. Well, they also brought jazz with them. So we see jazz really kind of becoming more of a nationally popular music. We actually see a lot of white artists pick up, the jazz genre and start out on their own. Okay, last thing for this section, we need to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so Harlem is a part of New York. I think it's kind of like above Manhattan even. That could be wrong. I'm not from New York. But Harlem, New York is a part of New York City. And it was really the largest black community in the world. It had over 100,000 African Americans living there. In the 1920s, like the name tells you, it's a renaissance. We see a lot of writing, a lot of poetry, a lot of music, a lot of kind of black culture really forming and being very prominent in the 20s. For example, a very, very famous poet, Langston Hughes, also Marcus Garvey, I hope I'm saying his last name right, Garvey, is a political leader, and he helps to found the UNIA. UNIA stands for United Negro Improvement Association. And really what they do is a couple of things. One, they promote resettlement of African Americans back to Africa. And the second thing they do is they really try to help sponsor black businesses. There's an example here, the Black Star Line Steamship Company. So it'd be like blacks would do business with other blacks to really help promote business within the black community. The problem was, most of these businesses actually failed. It was a good idea. And eventually Marcus Garvey was kind of creating too many waves. It was kind of making some U.S. politicians really anxious, kind of unnerved them a little bit. So actually he was convicted of mail fraud and deported by the U.S. government. Anyway, but, his organization, the UNIA, or the United Negro Improvement Association, gained about 4 million members. And although, a lot of the businesses failed, it was successful in really kind of bolstering some self-confidence among the black community. Section N, cultural liberation. Okay, so this is about writers. A lot of authors are mentioned. Well, not, there's some mostly authors. So I'm just going to give you like the Spark Notes version of this section. Okay, you can read it for yourself. So, cultural liberation. So a lot of the older authors who were very famous before World War I really kind of stopped writing after World War I. We see World War I is really a shift. After World War I, we see a lot more kind of just this new generation of authors. They have a lot of youth, a lot of vitality, a lot of energy. For example, F. Scott Fitzgerald, he was a Minnesotan-born man, educated at Princeton. He wrote two really, really famous works. The first one being in 1920, This Side of Paradise, which was more or less the Bible of the flapper generation. Okay, and then in 1925, also super famous, of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, which you've probably had to read at some point in your high school career. And The Great Gatsby, obviously, there's a movie out as well, more recent movie. And it talks about, just the pitfalls of wealth and social climbing, that sort of thing. Ernest Hemingway, obviously super famous. Ernest Hemingway was a veteran of World War I. He had worked in Italy during World War I for a time and actually saw combat or action. And he wrote a couple of books kind of talking about his experience in World War I or talking about veterans of World War I. He wrote 1926, The Sun Also Rises, and then in 1929, A Farewell to Arms. Both of those kind of World War I themed. William Faulkner, I pronounce that weird, but William Faulkner wrote The Sound and Fury, 1929, As I Lay Dying, 1930, and Absalom in 1936, which is a little later on. But really, William Faulkner's books all kind of have kind of a southern flavor to them. All of these stories take place in the South. For example, The Sound and the Fury really talks about the disillusionment of a prominent aristocratic Southern family who kind of fall from grace. Also, William Faulkner is also known for using kind of the stream of consciousness technique, which you may have heard of, which is, it's kind of confusing for the reader to follow because he'll kind of hop around from time period to time period without letting you really know what's going on. Anyway, poets. A lot of poets. Not going to explain them, just going to mention their names, even just so you know this is the 20s when they're really writing. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, E.E. Cummings, all of these poets are the 1920s. You should just know in New York City, Greenwich Village, you might have heard of that. Greenwich Village is really kind of the hub of this kind of new flapper generation artists. We see a lot of writers, painters, musicians, actors, a lot of artists really coming out of Greenwich Village in New York. Architecture, why not talk about architecture? This is the time where the Empire State Building is built in the 20s. And it actually gets the nickname of the Empty State Building instead of the Empire State Building because when it was finally completed in early 1931, it was left vacant for a very long time because we had the Great Depression crashing in 1929. So we built this huge, massive building in New York, and then no one had any money to rent that out. So anyway, also Frank Lloyd Wright, you've probably heard of him, kind of a big deal. He's definitely working in the 20s, and he's really creating a unique aesthetic in architecture. He's not just copying the Greek or the Roman style. He's really kind of developing a new artistic, some would say, aesthetic in architecture as well. Okay, last section. We're almost there. Praise the Lord. Section O. Wall Street's Big Bull Market. Okay, so just so you know, right? So there's two, when we're talking about the stock market, you can call it a bull market or a bear market. A bull market is usually when stocks are increasing in value over time, or at least expected to increase in value. And then on the flip side, a bear market, like a grizzly bear, a bear market is when stock prices are going down, when they're falling. So we'll see a bull market really in the 20s, and then 29, we get that huge panic, and we just see a crashing of the stocks, and it really brings in a bear market. Now you know. Anyway, so the signs that economic prosperity weren't here to last were actually quite all over the place in the 20s. We saw signs that this wasn't a healthy economy. For example, each year several hundred banks were closing. We saw a lot of real estate speculation, especially in Florida. And remember, speculation is when you would borrow a lot of money and then you would buy, say, a house in Florida. And your hopes is you go around, sell that house fairly quickly and make a profit. Okay, so a lot of people would be speculators. Borrowing money they really didn't have to buy a house they couldn't afford, with the idea that they could turn around, sell it quick for a profit, and then pay the loan back. Well, the problem was that there was a huge hurricane that came through and wiped out a lot of Florida during this time. So a lot of people lost money with that. But it's just an example of the speculation that was happening. Okay. With the stock market, we see a lot of people doing something called buying on margin. Buying on margin meant, once again, that you were borrowing money. Well, not necessarily borrowing money. Buying on margin is when you would purchase a stock, but only have to put a small percentage of that actually down. You're buying stock, but only putting a small fraction of that actual stock's value down. And people during the 20s went from rags to riches on the stock market. They saw a lot of stories of people really making it big, kind of riding this boom and bust cycle of the stock market. So a lot of people, ignored all those naysayers that said this bull market was not going to last. A lot of people invested a lot of money into the stock market. Okay. Also, you should know Washington during this time, very much a laissez-faire approach to the economy. They did not regulate the stock market hardly at all. The Secretary of Treasury at this time, you should know his name. He is a big deal. His name is Andrew Mellon. Okay, Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon. His whole philosophy of economics is kind of trickle-down economics. Give tax breaks to the rich. The rich will then invest in factories. Factories will produce jobs, and it'll help everyone out in the long run. So that's all of Andrew Mellon's idea, trickle-down economics. Let's talk about this a little more. After the war, really, people started to look at our national debt. In 1914, our debt was about $1 billion, more or less. But by 1921, our debt had increased to about $24 billion. So we were becoming more and more in debt. So finally in 1921, a Republican government was in control, and they set something up called the Bureau of the Budget, making sure, we were reining in our spending. And so what it did is it created, there's a director of the Bureau of the Budget, and this director was supposed to work with the president one-on-one to form a budget. So I think the first week of every February, the president was supposed to present his budget to Congress, and then Congress could make changes as it saw fit. Even today, that's the case. President Obama has gotten a lot of slack because he often does not submit a budget, and oftentimes if he does, it's kind of late. So we get government shutdowns, that sort of thing. I'm not pinning it on Obama, but I'm just saying this is where this, the idea of the president forming a budget comes from back in the 20s. Anyway, long story short, and also something to keep in note, we had a deficit, we had a debt. So after World War I, we kept the tax rates pretty high. During a war, of course, taxes are going to go up to accommodate the extra expenses of war. But after, World War I, the taxes were still staying pretty high. So some millionaires started to complain. They're like, hey, we're not in a war anymore, are we? Can we lower those taxes? That would be wonderful. And Andrew Mellon, thinking of this trickle-down economics, was right on board. So Andrew Mellon worked to really have a lot of tax reductions. For example, a reduction in estate tax, an income tax, getting away with the excess profits tax, that sort of thing. So we see, this is just an example, so you can kind of see the difference here. 1921, when taxes were really high, someone who made $1 million that year had to pay about 60% of that back in taxes, or about $663,000 in taxes. So 60% in taxes in 1921. That same person making $1 million in 1926 only had to pay 20% in taxes, or about $200,000. So we're really seeing this kind of 40% reduction in the amount of taxes the wealthy had to kind of shell out. So now, we still need tax money coming in. So what we really see is when, we're lifting this tax burden, you could say, off the shoulders of the wealthy, we were putting it on the shoulders of the middle class. So now the middle class became more responsible, had higher taxes, had to pay back more taxes. Yeah. And, this section just kind of ends by talking about the fact that Andrew Mellon is still kind of a controversial figure. Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? I don't know. Some say, look, he reduced our deficit or our debt by $10 billion. But other people would be like, hey, he should have continued to tax the wealthy, and he could have reduced that even further. Also, people think, well, if Andrew Mellon had created more taxes, kind of took some of that money away from the people, they would have had less money to throw into this kind of wild speculation, to throw into the stock market, and maybe they wouldn't have been hit so hard once, the crash of 29 came. All right, with that, we're done with this chapter.